In a quiet valley surrounded by tall baobab trees and rolling red earth, there lay a village known for its sacred fire. The people of this place were master craftsmen, makers of iron, creators of tools, and guardians of the ancient art of the forge. For generations, the blacksmiths of this village were respected not just as workers of metal, but as keepers of a divine gift. Their fire was believed to be a bridge between the living and the ancestors. Every spark that leapt from the anvil carried a whisper from the spirit world. Among them lived Kofi, the most talented blacksmith of his time. His arms were strong, his hammer steady, and his creation seemed to hold the breath of life itself. From sunrise to sunset, the rhythm of his anvil echoed across the village like a sacred drumbeat. Chiefs came from distant lands to buy his tools, warriors sought his blades, and farmers swore their harvests were blessed when they used Kofi's iron plows. People said he was born with the mark of fire, a blessing from the ancestors themselves. But with praise comes pride, and with success comes temptation. Kofi's fame began to grow beyond the borders of his village. Traders brought him gifts, chiefs paid him in gold, and songs were sung in his honor. Slowly, his heart began to change. He no longer knelt before the shrine of his forefathers before lighting the forge. He stopped offering the first spark of the day to the spirits who had once guided his hand. He believed that his skill came not from ancestral blessing, but from his own strength and brilliance. In the evenings, the elders would gather under the moonlight to pour libations and thank the spirits for another day of peace. But Kofi no longer joined them. "Why waste good wine on ghosts?" he once laughed. "The ancestors had their time. This is mine." His laughter echoed into the night like the crackle of a fire growing out of control. Still, the forge continued to burn, and his work remained unmatched. Villagers came to him in awe, but some whispered uneasily among themselves. "The fire spirits are patient," one old woman said. "They give before they take. But when they take, they leave nothing but ashes." Her words went unheard, carried away by the wind and buried beneath the ringing of Kofi's hammer. In the world of men, time passes quickly. But in the realm of spirits, every act, every offering forgotten, every lie told, leaves a mark that does not fade. The ancestors of Kofi's bloodline watched in silence. For generations, they had guarded the flame that forged the tools of life. Now, that flame had been turned into a tool of pride. And somewhere deep in the unseen world, a shadow stirred, waiting for the moment when balance would be restored. In this land, people believed that when a man worked with fire, he was touching both creation and destruction. Fire could warm or burn. It could shape iron or consume it entirely. It was the same with the human heart. And for Kofi, the blacksmith blessed by the ancestors, the line between those two worlds, the sacred and the sinful, was about to blur in ways he could never imagine. As the seasons turned and the rains came and went, Kofi's fame spread far beyond the red hills of his village. His forge became a place of pilgrimage. Chiefs sent messengers bearing gifts of cattle, salt, and gold dust, begging him to forge swords that would never break and hoes that would never rust. Travelers carried his name across rivers and savannas. He was no longer just a craftsman, he was a legend. Kofi's forge stood at the center of the village, and every dawn, when he struck the first blow of his hammer, the sound rippled like thunder through the air. Children would pause their games to listen, women pounding grain would hum along with the rhythm, and men returning from the fields would nod in pride. The fire of his forge glowed so bright that, even at night, it lit up the nearby trees like a small sun. People began to say that Kofi's fire never died, even when he slept. But success has a way of twisting even the purest flame. The man who once offered thanks before lighting the forge now began his day counting coins. Where once his face carried the soot of honest work, it now carried the sheen of greed. When poor farmers came asking for tools, Kofi mocked their poverty and sent them away. "Come back when you have gold," he would say. "The spirits do not forge iron for free." The villagers would bow and leave in silence, hurt and humiliated. He began to cheat those who trusted him. He mixed strong iron with soft metal, selling it as pure steel. He overcharged the wealthy, boasting that his work was blessed, though he had long stopped praying. When people reminded him of the rituals, he waved his hand in annoyance. "Do you think it's the ancestors who make my fire burn?" he scoffed. "It's me. My hands. My skill. No spirit holds my hammer." His arrogance grew so great that he built a new forge, larger, taller, with walls of polished stone. It was said that he named it the House of Fire, and carved above the door the words, "The world bows to the one who masters flame." He threw a feast to celebrate, inviting the richest men from nearby villages, but not the elders who had once blessed his tools. During the feast, as drums beat and wine flowed, an old diviner approached him. She was frail, her eyes clouded with the pale glow of one who sees beyond the world of men. She placed her hand on the ground and said softly, "The fire that forgets its prayer will one day burn its master." Kofi laughed so hard that wine spilled from his cup. "Old woman," he said mockingly, "your tongue is full of smoke and fear. My fire obeys me, not your spirits." The diviner bowed her head, murmured a prayer to the ancestors, and walked away. None of the guests dared to speak. Only the sound of the drums continued, heavy and uncertain, like distant thunder. From that night onward, something subtle began to change. The air around the forge felt different, thicker, heavier. The sparks from his anvil seemed to flash too bright, like eyes watching him. When he worked, he felt the fire grow hotter than it should, the iron softer than before, as if the metal itself were protesting. But Kofi ignored it. He believed power was his alone. He began to dream of himself seated on a throne of fire, wearing a crown of iron, while the spirits of his ancestors knelt before him. In the dream he laughed, and they turned away into darkness. Each time he woke, his chest throbbed with a strange ache, but he told himself it was pride, not warning. The village that had once admired him began to speak of him with fear. Children were told not to go near his forge after sunset, for strange shadows moved inside when the night grew deep. Dogs howled at the walls, and even the wind seemed to avoid passing through his yard. Yet Kofi walked proudly among the people, believing himself untouchable, chosen by his own strength. But the ancestors do not sleep forever, and when their patience ends, their silence becomes thunder. Somewhere beyond the world of flame and smoke, they stirred. The same spirits who had once blessed his hands now gathered to judge them. The balance between man and the sacred fire had been broken, and the first ember of his downfall had already begun to glow. The first sign came with the dawn, subtle and easily ignored. Kofi woke to find his forge cold. For years, his fire had never died, even through rain and storm. It had always burned through the night as though watched over by unseen hands. But that morning, the ashes were wet and dead. No glow, no spark, only silence. He cursed the night wind and relit the flame, thinking nothing of it. Yet as he worked, the iron refused to yield. The metal that once danced beneath his hammer now cracked like dry bone. Sparks leapt wildly from the anvil, biting his skin as though the fire itself had turned against him. At first, Kofi blamed his apprentices. He shouted, threw tools, and accused them of laziness. "You bring bad luck into my forge. He barked, his eyes burning brighter than the coals. But the boys trembled and swore they had done nothing wrong. Soon, they left him one by one, unable to bear his temper or the strange energy that filled the workshop. Then came the complaints. Farmers returned with broken hoes, hunters with spears that snapped in battle, women with knives that rusted overnight. "Your work is cursed," they whispered. Kofi roared in anger. "My work is perfect. You fools simply do not know how to use it." Yet deep down, doubt crept into his heart. His hammer felt heavier than before, his hands weaker. The forge that had once sung in harmony with his spirit now groaned with each strike, as if the iron itself mourned. At night, his dreams turned dark. He found himself standing in a vast field of ashes. Around him burned 1,000 forges, their flames rising like pillars into the sky. From each fire stepped figures, his ancestors, their faces carved in shadow and flame. They said nothing at first, only watched him with eyes that glowed like molten iron. Then, a deep voice thundered from the smoke. "Kofi, son of the fire, you have melted the honor of our bloodline. You forge with greed, not with gratitude." He tried to speak, to defend himself, but his tongue turned to iron in his mouth. When he woke, his sheets were soaked in sweat, and the faint smell of smoke filled his hut. The next day, a strange wind swept through the village. It was not the cool breath of the forest nor the warm gust from the hills. It was something heavy, whispering through the trees like a sigh from the underworld. The sacred tree that stood beside his forge, a tree that had lived longer than any man remembered, began to shed its leaves though the season was still green. Within days, its branches were bare. The elders shook their heads in silence. "The spirits are withdrawing their blessing," one of them murmured. Still, Kofi refused to listen. He drank palm wine to drown his fear and laughed at the talk of curses. "Let the ancestors come," he said. "If they are so mighty, let them face me." But that night, as the moon hung red and low, the wind rose again, stronger this time. The flames in his forge flickered, forming shapes, faces, fleeting and sorrowful. The metal on his anvil glowed blood-red and cracked down the center with a sound like a scream. The next morning, the villagers found him sitting outside his workshop, staring at the broken anvil. His eyes were hollow, his hair streaked with ash. When they asked what had happened, he only muttered, "The fire is angry." He spent the day trying to work again, striking iron after iron, but every piece shattered before his eyes. Then, one evening, the diviner returned, the same old woman he had mocked at his feast. She stood silently by the dead tree, her staff resting on its roots. "The ancestors do not curse without cause," she said softly. "They have spoken to you, but your ears are deafened by pride." Kofi glared at her, but his voice trembled as he spoke. "What do they want from me? I have built, I have created. I am the master of fire." The diviner's eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "No man masters fire," she said. "Fire only lends its strength to those who remember who gave it." She turned and walked away, her figure fading into the mist that had begun to settle over the village. Kofi watched her go, his jaw tight, his chest burning with defiance, but somewhere deep inside, a seed of fear began to sprout. That night, the fire in his forge burned blue. It hissed like a living thing, throwing no heat, only light. The walls of his workshop seemed to close in on him, the shadows growing long and sharp. And in the whisper of the flames, he thought he heard a voice, soft, mournful, and familiar, saying his name again and again, as though calling him to remember. Kofi lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, his heart pounding. The world felt heavier, quieter. Even the roosters did not crow that morning. The air smelled of rain, though no clouds crossed the sky. The ancestors were near, and the curse that had begun as whispers was about to speak with fire. The day the curse revealed its full strength began like any other. The sun rose over the red hills, casting golden light across Kofi's yard, and the air shimmered with heat. But something about the morning felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, and even the birds seemed afraid to sing. Kofi walked to his forge with tired eyes and trembling hands. He hadn't slept in days. His dreams had been filled with fire and voices, faces of his ancestors calling him from the smoke, their eyes full of sorrow. Still, pride chained his heart. He told himself that he was stronger than spirits, stronger than fear. He would prove it by working harder than ever before. That morning he prepared to forge a grand sword for a visiting chief, a weapon that, he hoped, would restore his name and silence the whispers of the villagers. He gathered coal, fanned the flame, and began his work. The fire roared higher than usual, bright and wild, but he welcomed it. "See," he muttered to himself, "even the fire obeys me." But as he struck the metal, something strange happened. The rhythm of his hammer faltered, and the sound no longer rang true. It echoed back from the walls of the forge, hollow and mocking. Sparks burst and fell to the ground, each one burning a small hole into the floor as though alive. The air grew hotter and thicker, choking him with smoke. The metal on the anvil began to twist and pulse like living flesh. Kofi stepped back in horror as the fire suddenly flared up, licking the walls, climbing higher and higher until it touched the roof beams. He tried to smother it, throwing sand and water, but the flames seemed to drink them in, growing stronger. The sound of crackling filled the air, followed by a deep, rumbling hiss, as if the forge itself were breathing. Then, a voice came from within the fire, deep and sorrowful, the voice of his great-grandfather. "You were chosen to create, not to destroy. You forged pride instead of honor, and now the fire claims its due." Kofi screamed. He stumbled backward as the roof burst into flames. The heat was unbearable, his skin stung, and the smell of burning wood and iron filled the air. Villagers rushed toward his home, shouting, forming a line with buckets of water. But no matter how much they poured, the flames would not die. They seemed to leap away from the water, feeding on the very air. The sky above darkened with smoke, and a strange wind began to circle the forge, howling like a living beast. When the fire finally calmed, it was not because of the villagers' efforts, but because it had devoured everything it desired. Kofi's great forge, the pride of the village, was reduced to ash and blackened stone. His house lay in ruins. The tools he had once crafted with pride were melted into shapeless lumps of metal. In the center of the ruin sat Kofi, alive but broken, his skin scorched, his clothes torn, and his eyes blank with disbelief. The people stood at a distance, whispering. None dared to touch him. They believed he had been marked by the ancestors themselves. For days, Kofi wandered the village like a ghost. He spoke to no one, ate little, and slept wherever the wind carried him. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled uncontrollably. He could no longer hold a hammer. Some said he had lost his mind. Others said the fire spirits had taken his soul. Children hid behind their mothers when he passed. The man who had once been a symbol of creation was now a walking reminder of punishment. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, the old diviner returned. She found Kofi sitting by the ashes of his forge, staring into nothingness. Without speaking, she sat beside him. The air was still, and the scent of smoke lingered like memory. After a long silence, she said, The ancestors do not destroy out of hatred, Kofi. They destroy to remind. Kofi's voice cracked when he spoke. Remind me of what? I have lost everything. My home, my craft, my name. What else is left to remember? The diviner's eyes softened. They remind you that the fire was never yours. It belonged to them, and through them, to the world. You used it for pride, not for service. And when a man forgets his purpose, the spirits strip him bare until he remembers who he is. Tears filled Kofi's eyes, falling silently onto the ashes at his feet. Can they forgive me? He whispered. The diviner looked toward the dead tree beside the ruins, its branches silhouetted against the crimson sky. Forgiveness is not given with words, she said. It is earned through humility. The ancestors will listen if you humble yourself before them. You must go to their resting place, the sacred grove of your forefathers, and ask not with your mouth, but with your heart. Kofi lowered his head. The weight of years of pride and blindness pressed down upon him. He realized then that all his life he had forged iron to prove his worth, but in doing so he had broken the bond that gave his fire life. His talent, his fame, even his forge, all had been gifts, not trophies, and he had squandered them. As the first stars appeared above the horizon, Kofi spoke again, his voice trembling but resolute. Then I will go, he said. If they will hear me, I will kneel before them until they do. The diviner rose slowly, leaning on her staff. At dawn, she said, bring with you what remains of your forge, the ashes, the broken hammer, the dust of what you once called your glory. Only by offering what you lost can you reclaim what was pure. Kofi nodded, his face streaked with tears and soot. For the first time in many years, he felt something unfamiliar yet sacred stir within him, humility. The wind shifted gently, carrying away the last curls of smoke from the ruins. It was as though the ancestors themselves were listening, waiting. That night, Kofi sat beside the remnants of his forge until the moon climbed high. The fire that had once consumed everything now burned only in his heart, a quiet trembling flame, not of pride, but of repentance. The curse had stripped him of all he had built, yet beneath the ashes, a path to redemption began to glimmer faintly, like the first spark before dawn. When the first light of dawn touched the sky, Kofi rose from the ashes of his ruined forge. The world was still wrapped in a soft gray mist, and the air smelled of damp earth and smoke. He gathered what little remained of his past, the broken hammer that had once sung in his hands, a handful of blackened ash from his forge, and a small clay bowl filled with millet wine. The offering of repentance. Each object trembled in his grasp, as though they carried the weight of his sin. He wrapped them in a piece of old cloth and began his journey toward the sacred grove where the ancestors of his bloodline rested. The path was long and silent. The birds did not sing as they once did, and even the wind seemed hesitant to move. Kofi's feet sank into the red soil, heavy with guilt and weariness. As he walked, he remembered the stories his father once told him, that in the grove, every tree was an ancestor, every whisper of leaves a voice from the beyond. But he had forgotten those stories, traded them for gold and pride. Now he walked not as a master of fire, but as a beggar of forgiveness. When he reached the grove, the air grew colder. The trees stood tall and ancient, their roots coiling like sleeping serpents, their trunks carved with the marks of countless generations. The ground was covered with fallen leaves that glowed faintly in the morning light. In the center stood a great stone altar, its surface smooth from centuries of offerings. Kofi fell to his knees before it. His hands trembled as he placed the hammer, the ashes, and the bowl upon the stone. For a long time he said nothing. The silence of the grove pressed around him like a living thing. Finally, he spoke, not in the proud voice of a craftsman, but in the broken tone of a man stripped bare. "Spirits of my fathers," he said, his voice trembling, "I have forgotten you. I turned the fire you gave me into a weapon of my pride. I lied, I cheated, I mocked your name. Now I am nothing. If my hands can no longer forge, let them at least remember how to beg. If you will not bless me, then teach me how to live without your light." A gust of wind stirred the leaves, circling him like unseen hands. The trees groaned softly, and the air thickened. The bowl of wine trembled where it sat. Then, from the depths of the grove, came a sound, a slow, deep hum, like the echo of distant drums. Kofi lifted his eyes, and saw a faint light forming between the trees. It was not sunlight, but a glow like fire seen through smoke. Figures began to emerge, translucent, shifting, their outlines made of light and shadow. The spirits of his ancestors. He bowed low until his forehead touched the ground. The figures surrounded him, silent at first. Then one stepped forward, a tall man with eyes like burning coals, his body clothed in flame. Kofi knew him instantly. It was his great-grandfather, Kojo, the first blacksmith of their family. Kojo's voice was deep and resonant, filled with both sorrow and strength. "Kofi," the spirit said, "the fire is not your enemy. You are its keeper, not its master. You were given the flame to build, to heal, to serve, but you used it to glorify yourself. You fed it with greed, and it devoured your soul. Yet, the fire also purifies what it burns. Your suffering is not your end, it is your beginning." Kofi wept openly, his tears falling into the ashes at his knees. "I have nothing left to offer," he said. "I have lost my home, my forge, my name. Then offer what cannot be taken," said the spirit. "Offer your humility, your repentance, your promise to restore what was lost to others." The wind rose again, swirling around the altar. The ashes lifted into the air and began to glow faintly, forming shapes, tools, blades, and ornaments, all flickering like ghosts of the things he once forged. Then, with a blinding flash, lightning struck a nearby tree. The thunder that followed rolled through the grove like a roar. When the light faded, the tree still stood untouched. The hammer on the altar gleamed faintly, as though newly forged. Kofi reached out, hesitating, then took the hammer into his hands. The trembling had vanished. His grip was firm, his arms steady once more. Warmth spread through him, not from the sun, but from within. An ancient fire reignited, gentler and wiser than before. He bowed low again, whispering, "I will remember. I will serve." The spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into light. The great-grandfather's voice lingered as the last echo. "The flame that serves is the flame that lives." Then the grove was silent again, but no longer heavy. The air was clear, and the first true rays of morning sunlight broke through the canopy, bathing Kofi in gold. He walked back to the village slowly, carrying the hammer as though it were sacred. When he arrived, the people watched in cautious silence. The proud man they had known was gone. In his place stood someone humbled, quiet, but burning with a new kind of strength. He rebuilt his forge, not grand and polished as before, but small and open, with space for others to gather. He invited the villagers to watch, to learn, to share in the fire. When the first tool he made, a simple hoe, was finished, he did not sell it. He gave it to a poor farmer whose fields had lain barren since the fire. "Use this," Kofi said softly. "Let it work for you as my hands once worked against the will of the spirits. Now they guide me again." The farmer wept, and soon word spread that the cursed blacksmith had been forgiven. Each day, Before lighting his forge, Kofi knelt and poured a drop of millet wine onto the earth, whispering a prayer to the ancestors. The villagers began to follow his example. Slowly, the fear that had gripped the village lifted. The tree that had withered beside his old forge began to sprout new green leaves. When the wind blew through them, it carried a soft, almost musical sound, the echo of a hammer striking in harmony with the world once more. Kofi's fire burned again, but this time it was not a flame of pride or greed. It was a flame of remembrance, a sacred light bound by gratitude and humility. He had walked through the ashes and returned carrying the lesson of his bloodline, that no man truly owns his fire. It is borrowed, it is trusted to him, and it must always be tended with reverence. Years passed, and the story of Kofi the blacksmith became more than a tale. It became a lesson whispered to every child born in the village. They said that if you passed by his forge at dusk, you could still hear the gentle rhythm of his hammer echoing like a heartbeat through the valley. It was no longer the fierce, proud pounding that once shook the ground. It was calm, patient, and steady, like prayer turned into sound. Kofi himself had grown older. His hair had turned white like the ashes he once cursed, and his hands were lined with age and labor. Yet his eyes were bright and peaceful. Each morning, he began the same way, by kneeling before his forge, placing his palm on the earth, and whispering, "I remember." He spoke to the ancestors not as a desperate man seeking favor, but as a humble son speaking to his eternal family. One evening, a young boy came to him, a curious, thin child named Abina, the son of a farmer. "Master Kofi," the boy said shyly, "teach me how to make the fire sing." Kofi smiled, recognizing the same spark he had once carried, though untamed and innocent. "Fire does not sing for everyone," he said softly. "It sings only for those who listen." So he took the boy under his care. Together they gathered coal, fanned the flames, and shaped the first small blade of the boy's life. But before striking the first blow, Kofi stopped him. "What do you offer to the fire?" he asked. Abina looked confused. "I have nothing," the boy replied. "I am poor." Kofi placed his wrinkled hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then offer your honesty. Offer your patience. Offer your respect." The fire accepts no gifts from greedy hearts. And when Abina struck the iron, the sound that rang out was pure and clear, the sound of truth. In time, Abina grew skilled. The forge once again became the heart of the village, not a place of trade and vanity, but a sanctuary of creation and remembrance. Every tool, every blade, every ornament carried the blessing of humility. People from distant lands came to learn from the blacksmith, who had been cursed by his ancestors and redeemed by his repentance. Kofi grew weaker with the years, but his spirit never dimmed. On his last day, as the sun dipped low over the hills, he asked Abina to light the forge one final time. The boy obeyed, and the fire rose, warm, golden, alive. Kofi sat beside it, his hands folded in his lap. "This fire," he whispered, "belongs to those who remember where it came from. Promise me, Abina, never let pride feed its flames." "I promise," the boy said, tears glistening in his eyes. Kofi nodded slowly. The air in the forge shimmered faintly, and for a moment, the boy thought he saw shapes in the smoke, faces glowing softly, smiling with pride. The ancestors had come to welcome their son home. Kofi's eyes closed peacefully, and with a final breath he said, "The fire lives on." That night, the villagers gathered to honor him. They placed his hammer and anvil before the sacred tree, which now stood tall and strong, its branches filled with life. The diviner, the same old woman, now ancient and frail, spoke with a trembling voice. He learned the truth that every heart must face. The ancestors bless those who create with reverence, and they punish those who forget the sacred bond between work and spirit. The people bowed their heads, and when the wind passed through the leaves, it sounded like a soft chorus of distant forges, ringing in perfect rhythm. From that day on, no one in the village began their labor without a prayer. The farmers poured a drop of water onto the earth before planting. The hunters whispered to the forest before drawing their bows, and every craftsman, before striking their tools, paused to say, "I remember." Generations later, the story of Kofi the blacksmith lived on. The forge he built became a shrine of sorts, not to his power, but to his humility. Children grew up hearing how one man's pride had nearly destroyed him, and how repentance had turned his curse into blessing. The old tree beside his forge was said to glow faintly on certain nights, its roots pulsing with warmth, as though the spirit of fire still lingered within it. And those who listened closely claimed they could still hear a voice in the wind, deep, steady, and kind, whispering the lesson that had saved him. Fire is not meant to serve pride. It is meant to serve life. Thus, Kofi's legacy endured. His life became a bridge between the living and the ancestors, between power and humility. In every spark that rose from a village forge, his story lived again, a quiet reminder that even the fiercest flames can become light when guided by reverence and truth. And so, the tale of the Blacksmith and the Ancestral Curse became one of the greatest moral stories told across the lands of Africa, a story not of punishment, but of redemption. A story that taught that every gift from the ancestors is sacred, and that only those who honor their roots can truly master the fire within.